Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Karajan's first Beethoven cycle with the Philharmonia remastered, and most of it's mono, but some of it's in stereo. It always sounded good, so it's perfectly listenable, including in this particular go-round the fourth and fifth piano concertos with Walter Gieseking, also enjoyable, and a Missa Solemnis with great soloists. I mean, my goodness, Schwarzkopf, Ludwig Gedda, and Zakaria, with the Philharmonia Orchestra and the chorus of the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in Vienna and the Singverein der Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde in the Missa. It's really a nice box to see back, and interesting for a lot of reasons. I mean, I'm not going to dwell on it since these performances are very well known, but here's the thing. Karajan made well, if you ignore videos, let's just talk about things that came out on regular CDs, 3 more Beethoven cycles. The next 3 were all on Deutsche Grammophon. There was 63, 72, and then the digital one, which is in many respects the least interesting of them all. Now, when Karajan, and they were all done in Berlin, not with the Philharmonia. Karajan, you will recall, was originally hired by producer Walter Legg, who was Schwarzkopf's husband, in order to train the Philharmonia Orchestra, which was subsidized by the Maharaja of Mysore, and which Walter Legg assembled with what he claimed were the best players in London and elsewhere, because he wanted a world-class orchestra after the Second World War, which London did not have. The LSO was scruffy. The LPO was really scruffy. There was Beecham with the Royal Philharmonic, but that was sort of his proprietary thing. It was all very, tribal and political and whatnot. And so Karajan did whip the Philharmonia into shape. But it's interesting to remember that this is Karajan before he was Karajan, before he imposed the sound, that thick, legato, luscious, heavy-duty string sonority on everything. The Philharmonia had its own personality, including, those snake charmer oboes, which were used to such marvelous effect by conductors like Otto Klemperer, who wanted very forward wind balances. Karajan was not for forward wind balances, but the orchestra itself was not that smooth, homogenized Berlin Philharmonic that came later, and whose presence was announced really by Karajan's 1963 Beethoven cycle on Deutsche Grammophon. Now, Karajan was not by nature a great Beethoven conductor. He was an efficient Beethoven conductor. As a conductor, you have to remember, aside from that timbral sauce that he later evolved, Karajan was a conductor in the Toscanini mold. He was strict in tempo, generally speaking, swift, very rhythmically precise. He was the opposite. He was the anti-Furtwängler, which is why Furtwängler hated his guts and knew that it was coming. And of course, Furtwängler regarded Karajan as an opportunistic Nazi, which he sort of was during the Second World War. Walter Legg didn't care about that. He just wanted to make better sounding records, and that was one of the reasons he was able to let Karajan come over to the UK and do work while his denazification happened and all that stuff. It was also true of Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, his wife. So and Legg was Jewish, which is all very, very interesting and psychologically, something to be investigated at another level. So Karajan's basic approach to this music, barely changed over his entire career. It was always sort of quick, efficient, rhythmical, well played. He kept it moving. It was exciting in spots. He was always exciting in like the seventh, and he never quite liked the Pastoral Symphony. He was always sort of happy to get it over with. But that's the way he was. And so the differences between the cycles have more to do with the sound of the orchestra and the sonority he was able to get from them than any differences in actual interpretation. And because the Philharmonia sounded different, less less worked over than the Berlin Philharmonic sounded, say, in the 1970s, the late 60s and 70s. There are a lot of people who think this is Karajan's best Beethoven. Ironically, because it has a lot of the least Karajan type sounds in it. And I understand that. I think that, the whole Karajan sound thing is kind of exaggerated. It's exaggerated because there are some performances or some composers where he really laid it on with a trowel. And, like the Schumann symphonies, for example. And those sort of overshadowed everything else he did. It just came to be assumed that if Karajan was conducting, this is what it was going to sound like. That wasn't always true. But I really do understand people who prefer hearing him with other orchestras than Berlin, because he was a very fine conductor. He did get the orchestras to do what he wanted to do most of the time. But there's some things you only achieve after years of working with a single ensemble. And so he couldn't get that with the Philharmonia, although he trained them quite well. He couldn't get that in Vienna, where that orchestra had its own identity that was every bit as they were every bit as proud of it and determined to preserve it as Karajan was of his identity. And so they met as a partnership of equals. And here there's a little bit of that going on, I think. It's very, very interesting comparing this Beethoven cycle to Otto Klemperer's Beethoven cycle. You're not going to believe it's the same orchestra half the time, but by the same token, it's not the Berlin Philharmonic either. As far as the other works go, the Beethoven concertos, well, those are well-known quantities. They're good performances. They aren't fabulous. Gieseking was also, he was a touch person. You'd think he would be really in sync with Karajan. He was all about sound and sonority, and not contrapuntal, linearity. But they're good performances. They're okay. They sound a little grotty. The Missa Solemnis I have never liked, and I still don't like it, despite the excellent soloists. The chorus is muddy. The orchestral framework is far too soft-edged for the work. I mean, the opening of the Gloria, you don't barely hear trumpets and drums. It's a soft-edged performance that I find to be superficially spiritual, but not anything like powerful enough to do justice to Beethoven's vision of the work. But, others may feel differently, and those soloists are great. So, that matters. That counts for something. So you also get the Egmont, Leonora No. 3, and Coriolan overtures, and 2 arias from Fidelio, sung by Schwarzkopf. And all told, this is a valuable and interesting re-release. I really do. I mean, it's another effort by Warner to cash in on the Karajan sweepstakes, of course, by constantly reissuing. And it would be nice to see a box of all the weird repertoire they forced him to do back in those days that he never touched again, like Roussel's Fourth Symphony and Stravinsky's Jeu de Cartes and the Vaughan Williams Tallis Fantasia and the Frank Bridge variations. And there's all kinds of cool stuff that he did. That he didn't remake for Deutsche Grammophon. That was part of the Mono Philharmonia years. It would be fun to have that stuff back, because some of it was marvelous. But anyway, Beethoven's what they're offering. Beethoven's what we're getting. And there is some sort of value in making these comparisons with his later Beethoven recordings, if that's what you're up for. If you're not up for that, you don't need this. You don't. They're perfectly wonderful Beethoven cycles, including by Karajan, that are in stereo and that have better sound and all that stuff. So there you go. Keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.